So again, welcome everyone. The session that you are in is How Am I Going to Do All This? Conveying lived experience of parents in child welfare cases. My name is Chris Roop. I'm the Executive Director with NAMI Fresno. I am also, as you heard earlier this morning, a NAMI California board member, and I'm currently serving as treasurer. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. Kelly Ranasinghe is Deputy County Counsel and Board Certified Child Welfare Law Specialist through the National Association of Counsel for Children. He currently works in Imperial County, representing the Department of Social Services, Children and Family Division. Mr. Ranasinghe is also a NAMI Connections peer facilitator and was president of NAMI Northern Nevada. Mr. Ranasinghe previously worked as a senior program attorney at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and he has conducted trainings on the intersection of mental health, the legal system, and family violence. We also have with us Jocelyn Mejia. She is a protective services worker with the Imperial County Department of Social Services and has worked in the Children and Family Services Division for 7 years. Ms. Mejia has worked in the Emergency Response Unit, the Court Unit, and Continuing Services, also known as the Reunification Unit. Ms. Mejia works directly with youth of all ages, as well as parents actively involved in the dependency system. She's also the Indian Child Welfare Act, IWCA, worker and works closely with tribal social services on sensitive ICWA cases. Throughout her career, Ms. Mejia has handled complex mental health cases, including mental health and dual diagnosis, domestic violence, and youth with severe mental illness. She has trained protective services workers and is also a certified forensic interviewer. Today, Kelly will discuss how parents with severe mental illness are nearly 8 times more likely to have CPS contact. Parents with disabilities have their children removed and parental rights terminated at disproportionately high rates. Kelly and Jocelyn, welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Hello, everyone. Hi, this is Kelly Ranasinghe and Jocelyn Mejia. We are so happy to have you here with us. Greetings from the wonderful Imperial Valley. As the wonderful board of directors said, we both work in child welfare. I am a deputy county counsel here. Jocelyn, did you want to say hello?
Hi. It's great to be here today, and I'm excited, for our presentation today. This will be something interesting for you guys too.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to jump into our slideshow right now. How am I going to do all this, conveying the lived experience of parents in child welfare cases? Want to looking at questions?
Yeah. So some of the objectives that we're going to be taking care of today will be exploring the fundamentals of child welfare cases and how a parent with mental illness is affected by dependency law, evaluate how reunification rules and policy in California can affect someone with mental health needs, and affirmative steps to mitigate disproportionality. And we'll role play a little bit of how lived experience can be used in dependency cases to communicate needs and successes.
Thank you so much. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is a hypothetical. And if there is a mechanism in which you can display this in your chats or provide this information back to us, that would be great. So our hypothetical begins. Casey is a 30-year-old single mother with bipolar disorder. She lives in a rural area of southeastern California. She has 2 children, Lisa and Miles, who are 6 years old and 8 years old. Casey recently lost her father, and over the past 2 weeks, her mental health has been declining. She's called 911 multiple times, claiming that men are coming to her house, watching from her windows, and have been entering while she's asleep and moving things around. Casey claims she's being targeted by the cartel. As a result, Casey has barricaded several doors in her home and neglected the inside of the home. Casey's also begun using marijuana in and around the home. A school official called in a referral on Casey after both children noted they were worried about their mom when she is, quote, scary. Casey's at risk of losing her apartment and is also running out of food. After the referral, CPS conducted an investigation and discovers that the home is in complete disarray. It's unclean. There are multiple objects piled to the ceiling. There are several dangerous objects and chemicals in reach of the children, including knives and marijuana. CPS removes both children. Casey is provided a notice with a court date by the social worker on it saying, you come to court Monday. She is completely distraught, as are both of her children. What are some of the things right now that Casey may be feeling? What questions does she want answers to? And what is she worried about? So I'm going to stop the share for the moment. And Sophia, can you unmute folks? Can they speak into the actual Zoom meeting?
We can do that. We currently have that permission.
Sophia?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I can unmute people if that's something that you want me to do.
Thank you. Could you please unmute folks?
Let me see. I see that Brianna Castro has her hand up, so I'll go ahead and unmute her. Or mute, yeah.
Sweet. Go for it.
I would say she's feeling extreme fear and probably anger because her children are being moved.
Anyone else? And if you want to, you can use your hand feature raise in Zoom so you can raise your hand. Sunshine Cruzen? Sophia, can you unmute her? Thank you.
Okay. I was just going to say she's definitely grieving deeply after losing her father, and it's made everything in her life decline.
Definitely.
That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, Casey, for sure grieving. What questions might she want answers to right at that point? I'm gonna pick on you, Sunshine, since
I
you're
was
the
just
only
going to say,
person
it's
that
okay.
unmuted.
How can I get help? Like, maybe she's not even aware of resources, or, you know, afraid that her children are going to be taken away. So,
yeah.
Or she might even be in denial. I'm not sure. I need a little more info, but those are the things that come to my mind.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks.
So someone else, what is she worried about right now? What is she worried about? This is a quiet group. We're going to give it a couple more seconds.
Sorry, I see Angelina maybe wanting to say something, and I'm just working on my end.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So I would imagine that this person might be running the gamut of feelings, right? That there's maybe not one or two or 10, like there could be a colossal of things happening simultaneously. But I would think the first thing would be maybe loneliness. When someone dies and you miss them, just even normally, it's hard. But to have your children taken away and then you're left alone, it would be, at least as I imagine it, probably something that is inexplicable.
That's
And
good.
the idea of
Yeah.
asking for help seems almost impossible.
Yeah, and those are all great answers. A lot of the families that we're working with, the parents, will report to feeling, guilty, scared, confused, lonely, all of these things. And, the dependency process in itself is incredibly overwhelming at times. And, so they're worried just what's going to happen next, so.
Outstanding. Okay, let's keep on moving. So, parents with mental illness, let's talk a little bit more about this. And it's important to keep in mind the disproportionality that is going on regarding parents with mental illness that are system involved. Parents with mental illness, regardless, across the board, they are 8 times more likely to have a CPS contact. And what that means is, someone knocks on your door and says, hey, I'm here from Child Welfare Services, I'd like to talk to you. Just in and of itself, that is very frightening. parents with mental illness are 26 times more likely to have their child's placement altered by CPS. And those last words, have the placement altered, that means that the child can be moved from their parents' home into a foster home. It may mean that they can move from a foster home into a relative home. It can mean that they move from a relative home into a group home, or what we now call a short-term residential treatment program. What we do know is that anytime there is a movement, anytime you sort of pluck a child up from where they're living and put them somewhere else, that is traumatic to everyone inside the child welfare system, including both parents and children. We know that mothers with mental illness are more likely to have CPS system involvement, and that does correlate with gender discrimination inside the child welfare system. We know that mental illness affects parenting behavior. That's not rocket science. Anyone with mental illness knows that your symptoms are going to affect daily tasks, and that includes like getting kids up, taking them to school, doing their homework, getting food, going out and shopping. We know that that's nothing new. But the big thing here is that we know that parents with mental illness are much more likely to have parental rights terminated. And inside the child welfare system, that's kind of the end game. That means that you are not the parent anymore. That means that your kids get adopted and there is no more parent-child relationship. So Jocelyn is now going to talk to you a little bit more about some terms of art we have when we're going through this workshop, and also that you might hear when you're working with parents inside the child welfare system that have mental illness.
Okay, so the first one, removal. That would be the legal removal, and it would be clear and convincing evidence that child is at substantial risk of serious physical harm or illness. That's essentially, when we remove the kids or the child and we pretty much say, okay, child is not safe at home. And so we need to intervene at this point. Reunification would be services designed to alleviate the problems that led to the child to be removed. So that is basically the objectives and services that are court ordered for the family to reunify, for the child to go back home with the parents. What's going to make it safe for us to, be okay with returning them? Reasonable services, ideally we want all of our services and case plans to be tailored to each family. We specifically tailor the fit of the circumstances, and they have to be designed to eliminate those conditions which led to our intervention. Reunification time, do you want to?
Okay, so I'm gonna take reunification time because it's really, really important.
Yes.
When you are working with parents and children inside the child welfare system, it's really important to kind of get the timeline in your head. California has one of the most aggressive reunification statutes in the country. In California, if a child is under the age of 3, you only get 6 months. That's it. That is the end game. You only get 6 months of reunification time. After that 6 months of reunification time have gone by and the child is still out of the parent's home, the Department of Social Services can file a petition saying, you know what, child, parent, too much reunification time has gone on. We are going to terminate your parental rights. Now, if a child is over the age of 3, you get 12 months of services. And that's a little bit more time. But in the panorama of mental health recovery, it is not a lot of time. What this does is it means that you really got to front load your services. I'm going to go into that right now. So this is kind of an overview of how the dependency process works, right? Now you have your removal right here. This is kind of where you have the crisis point of a mental health case. This is your 5150s. This is where police are involved. This is where law enforcement is coming to the home, or child welfare is responding to the home. And that is kind of where you see the highest amount of presentation of symptoms. Now, it's important to remember the vast majority of cases that are referred to CPS are not removals. They're not removals. And in fact, sometimes when we're speaking with families, they get a little frustrated because they're like, look, I've called the CPS hotline multiple times. You are not removing, or you're not doing anything. But in fact, 90% of cases that are referred to the CPS hotline really aren't removals in any event. Pop culture kind of, depicts this idea that, you call CPS, someone goes to the home, and then it's an automatic removal, and children are sort of taken away into a foster home. And in fact, it's really, that's not reality. CPS usually has a mandate first not to respond, but then also not to take children away from the parents, and finally to keep children, all siblings together and in a relative home. And that's really kind of how good dependency works. Now, assuming there was a removal for mental health presentation or crisis mental health, the next hearing that's going to go is a jurisdiction hearing, and that's where the Department of Social Services will go and say, look, court, based upon everything that we know right now, this is a case where the juvenile court needs to assert jurisdiction over this family, and it's quote unquote the trial. Now, this happens about 30 to 45 days after the removal, optimistically. That's why it's very important, if you are working with families that have this sort of issue, that you front load your mental health services as much as possible. Now, keep in mind, at the point of removal, when you're going and bringing this family before the court is going to say, you know what, Department of Social Services, I'm going to order right now that you provide reasonable services designed to bring the children back into the home. So what does that mean? What sort of services are you going to order when you have a family that has that is being affected by mental illness, severe mental illness? Now, assuming that the court finds jurisdiction, it's going to go to disposition, and this is kind of where the court looks and says, all right, we've removed, I've asserted jurisdiction. Right now, is there still a substantial danger to the physical, emotional health and welfare of the children that justifies me, the judge, to keep these kids out of the home? And in certain cases, there is. Now, once the court removes, or what's called legally removes, the children from the family, the court's going to point at the agency and say, Department of Social Services, you are going to provide reasonable reunification services to get this family back together. And it's up to you to determine what those services are. And I'm going to give you 6 months. And then the court sets a 6-month review. Now, if your child is under the age of 3, if it's an infant, 0 to 3, that's all you get. In some circumstances, you can increase services to the 12-month or the 18-month, and in really, really rare circumstances, you can increase services to the 24-month review, but it's very, very rare. Ultimately, if the parent is not completing reunification services adequately, and the court cannot make that finding that says the child is safe to go home, we are heading toward the infamous selection and implementation hearing, or what we call the 2-6 hearing. This is the hearing we don't want to be at, because that is the hearing where the court says, you know what, reunification is no longer an option, and we are going to either terminate parental rights, which in California is the preferred plan, and adopt the child out. We're going to put the child in guardianship, or we are going to put the child in long-term foster care. We don't want to be here. We don't want to be here. We want to be up here, where the child, somewhere in this process, is returned and returned home to the family in a safe manner, with integrity, with services, which makes the process of reunification sustainable. That's where we want to be. And I'm pointing at the screen. Obviously, you can't see me. I'm going to use the arrow. That's where we want to be. All right.
Okay. So, so reasonable services advocacy. To provide reasonable services, the agency must identify the problems which led to the loss of custody, design services to remedy the problems, maintain reasonable contact with the parent and the child, and make reasonable efforts to assist the parent when compliance has proved difficult. This is basically, what our goal is, to make sure that, we're compliant with all of this, make sure that we're helping the family. So one example of this would probably, be, let's see, I have a...
Jocelyn, what happens? We're trying to maintain confidentiality. Jocelyn, what happens if a client is homeless? Do you have to reach out to them?
Yeah, no, of course, yeah. So we have to make all, I will, essentially go out and look for them in hospitals and everything. Like, there's no, we have to be able to eliminate those barriers in order to kind of engage the parents and make sure that we are able to provide everybody with the services that they may require. One example of this would be, for mental health clients that I may have, a lot of times, one of the cookie cutters case plan or type of services that they used to provide would be all parents get parenting, all parents get a psych eval, all parents get counseling services or what have you. But if, for example, what if we have a family where the parent had maybe like a psychotic episode, and maybe perhaps around, other parenting areas are not being affected by this. They have a good support, they have, but this was an isolated incident. Law enforcement may have gotten involved. They may have ended at crisis. And so at that point, we obviously had to remove. But my case plan would not reflect a parenting class if I notice that parent is responsible, is well involved in school, is meeting their, their needs for the child, whether it be medical, dental, like everything.
And one thing I would add to this is it's important to narrowly tailor the reasonable services. So, for instance, if a client is, schizophrenic, not taking his medication, has active psychosis, you can't hand him a letter that says, please go attend this parenting program. Because obviously he's in a situation where he's not going to benefit from that parenting program. You can't, for instance, hand a letter saying, we would like you to go get a psych eval 30 miles away. And the client is homeless and has no ability to transport himself to that psychological evaluation. Reasonable services inside the child welfare system really mean you have to give reasonable efforts to assist the parent when compliance is proved difficult. Okay, all yours.
So this goes back to that, reunification will look different for everybody. Like, not all, families require the same type of services. Kelly mentioned that, if it's someone that suffers from schizophrenia, obviously I'm not just going to be like, okay, I sent out a referral and, you're good to go. The expectation is that we're pretty much trying to engage with them, meeting with them, transporting them, trying as best we can in order to meet them where they're at and helping them, because the goal is always to have these kids safely returned home. And so, it's not going to look the same for everybody.
Cool. So. And one of the things I also say is that it's important to remember that clients who are experiencing active mental illness sometimes are going to be moving in and out of different systems. So they might be moving in and out of jail, they might be moving in and out of institutionalization, in and out of inpatient treatment. That does not affect our duty to provide reasonable services. So if the client is in jail, it's up to the social worker to maintain communication and visitation. These are mandates, really, that the court and the case law place upon social services at the inception of the removal. By the way, if anyone has any questions at this point, please raise your hand. We will be taking questions at the end of the session, but if you kind of in your head, we have an urgent question, please raise your hand and we'll be happy to address it. So we remember Casey, right? Casey in our hypothetical, and we're thinking she's at disposition. The court has entered a legal removal, which means Casey is now in reunification. What are some of the things a parent with mental illness needs for recovery? What are some of the things a parent with mental illness needs for recovery? All right, so I want you to think about that and raise your hand if you would like to tell us what are some of the things you're thinking about that a parent with mental illness needs for recovery. And this is exclusive of resources. It's exclusive of your, the limitations that your community may have. If you could wave your magic wand and say, hey, I think this parent should get this in order to help her recover and get her child back, what do you think they would need? And please raise your hand in Zoom, and I will have our wonderful moderator unmute you so you can tell us. Chirp, chirp.
I know.
This is also our reaction as well.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
Okay.
Nothing in the chat box at this time. What I can do to make this just a little simpler is I'm gonna enable the chat box on Zoom just for simple communication.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. That will help us. That will help us a lot. Let's enable the chat box, and people can sort of put in what they think.
Okay,
All
so
right.
it should be open to participants. Just use the chat box feature that's at the bottom of the screen next to the participants and more if you're looking on the Whova app.
All right. Anyone have any thoughts? What does a parent with mental illness need for their recovery? What would Jocelyn be providing to this parent with mental illness?
This is Chris. I think support, yes. What Brianna just typed, support, and from a peer perspective.
Cool. So what does support look like for a parent that is involved in the child welfare system? What do we say in our connections groups, first of all? We are non-judgmental, we appreciate the symptoms, and we recognize and validate a parent's emotions. So that's one example, definitely support. Now, are there dimensions of peer support inside child welfare? Yeah, absolutely. One of them is Parents Anonymous. There are also the NAMI warm lines. There's also, for instance, in NAMI San Diego, we have the Children, Youth, and Family Liaison. Let's see, we got another person in the chat. Rihanna says support. I'm gonna click over here. Counseling, possibly more than twice a month. Now, it's interesting because one of the things that we do is that in reunification, we refer a person to mental health services, and we say, we want you to do this mental health services, but sometimes we don't actually check what is the frequency of those mental health services. So it's quite possible that reasonable services might actually say, you need weekly counseling, psychiatric support, peer support, visitation and contact to sort of mitigate that trauma, help with housing and income, referrals to legal assistance, for instance, if the client is a refugee or she is an immigrant. Interesting point. Inside the child welfare system, if you have an undocumented child that cannot reunify with one parent, they are also entitled to special immigrant juvenile status, or SIJS, which allows them to move their immigration status up toward a higher level of status, sometimes culminating in permanent resident status. Victim assistance, and I cannot say this enough, victim assistance. Individuals with mental illness are disproportionately affected by victimization for crime, particularly females with mental illness. So it's really important to screen for victimization, substance abuse treatment, and 100%, we don't judge. We say that in every facilitator group, we don't judge.
In the chat.
Oh, do we have one more in the chat? So, oh yeah, Denise said continuing psychiatric care. Absolutely. Now, Denise, when you say, I'm gonna go back here really quick, actually. When you say continuing psychiatric care, does that mean, hey, I'm gonna give you a psychiatric referral and you guys deal? No, it actually means that you have to continue following up with making sure that the client is attending psychiatric appointments, taking their medication. It might even be saying, hey, you should use this application to keep track of your medication. Sometimes as a counsel, what Jocelyn and I will do is that we'll actually set up intervening court. So we'll set up 30-day, 45-day, 60-day reviews so that client with mental illness can come back to court and we can keep it on the front burner saying, hey, are you taking all your medication? Are you experiencing any new symptoms? Do we need to send you back to psychiatry for a different evaluation? It's really important because remember, we're facing that 6-month clock, particularly on cases from 0 to 3. So why is conveying lived experience so important? And it's important to remember that just because someone is working in the child welfare system and is awesome like Jocelyn The average social worker may not understand the importance of lived experience. You know, the average advocate, the average lawyer may not understand how lived experience really is life-changing. So people affected by mental illness, we are experts by experience. And it's important sometimes to convey this to the court so that you can provide human context to difficulty to accessing services. So for instance, if I'm county counsel and I hear someone say, well, it looks like we referred the parent to mental health services 3 times and they didn't go, and then they called the provider and they made another appointment and they didn't show up. What does that mean? How does that mean? Were they psychotic? Were they unable? Were they dealing with other stuff? Were they trying to balance their symptoms and their ability to organize their appointments? Were they having a very bad mental health day and they weren't able to get up and go to their provider? Did we offer telehealth? Providing the human context to accessing these services is very important to the court. It also illustrates intersectional dimensions of oppression. Intersectional dimensions of oppression are poverty, victimization, minority status, living in a rural community, and you slap mental health on top of that, and it makes it incredibly difficult for people to access services. So, Jocelyn and I, we educate decision makers on how reasonable services should be widened and how we look at it, and also redefining power and privilege. A person with lived experience is the expert on themselves.
And that's actually something that is often used in our practice that, you know, we discussed. I mean, I'm not going to be the expert as to what things are going on in your home, what specific, you know, behaviors may look like, what your parenting style is like, and just what you've been through, you know, that has kind of brought you to where we're at. So definitely that's, you know, the person is an expert on themselves. So I think that's it.
Stigma.
Okay. So when we're talking about stigma, you know, we're talking about suicide, past experiences, or mental health crises. We're talking about abuse, mental health needs, children with mental illness, and trauma. But it does not equal risk. So that doesn't necessarily mean that because these things are present or because you've experienced, you know, some of these things, it's going to affect your ability to provide safety, or that it's affecting some sort of way that they can parent or care for their child.
Justin, can I just ask you a question? Does the parent think that you'll think it's risk?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So a lot of the times, and that's something that, you know, that we have to kind of make sure that we let them know. My discussion with a parent when I'm initially meeting them is that I'm, you know, I'm here to work with you. I'm not here to judge you. Everybody makes mistakes. My intention is pretty much like, you know, hey, you know, we're here. You know, I'm always telling them, you know, I've seen the dirtiest of homes. I've seen, you know, really, you know, unfortunate situations. And so to me, it's more trying to work with them and make them feel comfortable in order to, you know, get to the bottom of it and make sure that, you know, we're properly assessing for what their needs are. But yeah, of course, they have that stigma of, you know, they're going to try and not disclose, you know, any type of mental health issues, any type of trauma. So, I mean, it is something that we have to navigate through.
Now, can I ask you another question? Are there cultural barriers to talking about this?
Yes. Yeah. A lot of times, you know, just in the Hispanic culture, you know, a lot of things is like, you know, mental health issues are something that even now, I mean, we're progressing toward being able to be more open about, but, you know, they're like, we're not crazy, or, you know, things like that are said. And so they're like, you know, that's something that we constantly have to kind of work through with the families and reassuring them and meeting them where they're at. I always tell them, look, the worst thing that could have happened, you know, we're here, has happened. And so at this point, it's like, we're just trying to help you and work, you know, toward everything. So.
So I want you to go back, and we're going to do one more quick roll. We're going to do one more quick question and answer. And this time, I'd like you to answer in the chat. All right, I'd like you to answer in the chat, and I want you to think about your own clients. This is my friend Judge Aycock. Judge Aycock is a tribal judge in Colville Tribe. You are a peer specialist working with a family that is inside the child welfare system. And you have to understand, the majority of judges don't know what you know. The majority of judges sometimes have lived inside the civil legal system, handling vehicle accidents or torts or employment litigation. And you can be a judge who has handled car accidents his entire life and suddenly be picked up and plucked into mental health court. You can be a judge that has handled patent law, for instance, his entire life, and suddenly he is plucked and put into domestic violence court. So how do you, as an advocate, explain to Judge Aycock the challenges and barriers to services of a person with mental illness? Thinking about your clients, go ahead and put that into the chat box. Explain how you would, what are the first things that you would say to Judge Aycock about working with people with mental illness? Go ahead and put that into the chat box now. And I'm going to monitor the chat box really quick. Anybody? I'm going to start calling on people. So, you know, and sometimes, all right, the lack of resources in our area, also accessibility to get to appointments due to mental illness. Ms. Castro, what do you mean by that? And I think I know what you mean, but is it easy for people who have post-traumatic stress disorder? Is it easy for people with schizophrenia to suddenly just grab their car, go ahead and drive 20 miles to the nearest psychological evaluation and talk about their life experiences? One of the things I tell new interns and new social workers is this. Imagine turning to someone you don't know and having a detailed conversation about the trauma in your life and your mental health symptoms, your deepest, darkest symptoms, and how you should get services for them. Just turning to someone you've never known. That's what we ask people to do in the child welfare system. And it's hard. And we should recognize that that's the biggest challenge. That's one of the biggest challenges to the child welfare system in reunification, is having someone turn around and expecting them to bare their soul and tell a social worker everything. And Jocelyn's an expert at getting people to do that, but also recognizing the trauma that that can cause.
And so I think that also it's really important that, you know, like you're saying, how do you explain to a judge this? You know, a lot of times it's explaining the behavioral things that are occurring. You know, instead of just like, oh, they didn't go to this appointment. It's more, you know, in detail, like you said, you know, explaining they're experiencing all these things. They physically cannot get out of bed because, you know, they're depressed, what have you. It just is really important to kind of give them also a perspective of like where they're coming from, because the goal, you know, the parent usually is that, you know, they want to have their child returned home, and it's not something that they can control, you know, so.
Okay.
What was in the chat box? Any questions?
Oh, let me just check. Let me just check our chat box really quick and see. Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen again. Let's go back here.
Shared empathy and validation.
Shared empathy and validation. Shared empathy and validation. 100%. So the big guy in the black robe, he is the person that is making these determinations upon the key elements inside a child welfare case. So he cannot make those decisions about reasonable services, substantial compliance with reunification, identification of barriers, expanding reunification time, and ultimately return of the child. He has nothing to make those decisions with unless he has the information. So if you are working with a family that is inside the child welfare system, you have got to get that information about lived experience to the guy in the big black robe. How are you going to do that? Your first point of contact is through the parent's attorney. And in California, all parents are appointed counsel. You can absolutely talk to the parent's attorney if your client gives you permission. Second point of contact is through the social worker. Third point of contact is yourself. So there's several ways you can do it. Now, if you're working with a child, it's a lot easier because that child is going to have a children's attorney, and it's wonderful to talk to the children's attorney and just kind of drop this information on their desk because they are a one-way conduit to providing that information to the court. But you also have to remember, in California, there are documentary mechanisms to get that information to the court, and they're all through the California Judicial Council forms. For instance, if a child is on psychotropic medication, there's a form that you can fill out, a child's opinion on psychotropic medication. That's a one-way ticket to the court, to the judge's desk. If a child is going into a group home, there's a form that the child can fill out saying, hey, I have mental health symptoms. I don't think this is a good move for me. That is also a one-way ticket to the judge's desk. It's important to kind of learn these techniques by talking to other professionals so that you can get this information to the guy in the big black dress so he can take a look and say, well, this client has a pretty substantial lived experience. Remember, the key thing that the court is ruling on is, did the Department of Social Services provide reasonable services? Did they work with this client with mental illness? Did they reach out? Were they in jails? Were they trying to find him if he was homeless? Did they just hand him a stack of referrals and walk away? Because that's not the way we treat people with mental illness. Did the department identify the barriers to his services and try and meet those barriers? And ultimately, should the child be returned to the parents' care? Now, the other thing I want to mention is this: that 6-month barrier can be pushed up to 12 months and to 18 months if you are able to show, hey, my parent is working on it. There is a substantial likelihood he's going to be able to meet his mark in the next 6 months. And that's kind of the meet the mark. So you have to keep that client in active services. And we know sometimes that can be very hard with a person with mental illness. It can be really hard, but that's what the law says we have to do. Okay. Oh, we do have something in the chat. Access to services are sometimes late-listed, lengthy processes to be admitted. Ooh, Roxy, you came up with a really good point. So social worker says, hey, I need you to go to this counselor. And the counselor says, you know what? We would love to have you as a client. Come back in 45 days. I should have some time on my schedule. Is that reasonable services? No. There's no waitlisting excuse. No. Those serve not when you have 6 months of time. So again, this is where a good mental health peer specialist, a good advocate, a good attorney will come back to the court and say, Judge, we can't be waiting around here. My client needs these services now. And that's really important because that's something that most attorneys don't know. They expect services to start immediately. They expect recovery to be starting from the point of removal, and in reality, it's not that way. And in fact, one time I had a really existential discussion with a judge where I said, Judge, my client has had a prescription for medication, psychotropic medication, but she's not getting it. And the judge didn't understand it. He's like, why can't they just go to the pharmacy and get it? And I'm like, that's not how it works with some psychotropic medication. Sometimes you have to wait 30 or 45 days. Sometimes they run out. It's not like getting, penicillin.
Yeah, no, and to back on that, basically, yeah, like we encounter that, of course, here especially, we are super limited in resources. And so a lot of times it's, especially hard to actually,
Oh,
we need to.
whoops. Wow, we're at 12:10. Okay, wait. One last thing before we go. I wanted to end with this. Okay, we're at the end of our time. This is the last thing I would say. Okay, this is California law. The existence of a mental illness is not itself a justification for dependency jurisdiction. It cannot be presumed that a parent who is mentally ill will necessarily be detrimental to the mental or physical well-being of their children. There are innumerable eccentric parents whose behavior on certain occasions is less than socially acceptable, and yet they are loving and compassionate parents. That's the last thing we'd say here. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much. I really appreciate you all being here. And I'll turn it back over to Chris.
Thank you.
Oh, what a wonderful presentation. So many complex parts of supporting parents living with mental illnesses who end up in welfare cases. And Kelly, I just have to tell you that last slide you just showed, I snapped a shot of that because I think that's one of the things when we encounter parents on this type of journey, there's such a fear that living with a mental illness alone risks their ability to keep their children in their custody. So I appreciate you closing with that so very much. And we are a little over time, so I want to thank everybody. I know if you've got questions, we will get those answers to you. I don't see more questions in the chat box itself. I don't know if there are any over on the conference platform. But I want to let everybody get to lunch ASAP. So I'm going to close up.